Well, I think everybody here knows the story of Moses, right? How he led his Jewish people out of the state of oppression while he was there in Egypt through 40 years of wilderness until finally they found the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Back to the land where their ancestor Abraham had settled it, or very close near to it. And one can certainly understand the joy that must have been felt by people so long persecuted and wandering in the wilderness who finally returned to their home. And a very similar story is told today about the founding of Israel in 1948. After 2,000 years of persecution, of being scattered in the wilderness of the world, the Jewish people came back to this area, this homeland, where they had been ousted so long ago, to establish a place without persecution or oppression. And once again, one can understand that desire and that joy. But what people don't always tell you about this wonderful story that helps define many of the Jewish people is that there were people already living in these lands for generations and generations, people with families, with ways of life, a culture. In the first story, there were 7 Canaanite tribes who inhabited 31 fortified city-states scattered over the entire area, each ruled by its own king. Now we know they were also allied by Egypt because the pictures we have of them come from Egyptian hieroglyphs. And then of course the second story was that there were Palestinians living there when the Jewish people came back after the Holocaust, and even before. In both cases, the oppressed became the oppressors, driving out the people already living there or conquering them. And it isn't just the Israelis over the Palestinians that do this. The oppressed often become the oppressors because, quite frankly, what else do they know? They're often continuing a cycle of violence that began a long time ago. And even here in the United States, we think of the great pilgrims who came to this land, right, searching for that brave new world, fleeing all that oppression in Europe. But by golly, there were people already living here. And this is what happens throughout history. When we want something and there's opposition to whatever it is that we want, we call it the Doctrine of Discovery. And we use whatever it means that we have to get what we want. And we resort to that rhetoric to justify the oppression. I always thought the Doctrine of Discovery, which basically says, well, if I sort of discovered you and I have more power, I get to keep it. It should be called gimme, gimme, gimme. You know, we have the Romans, right? They called their empire the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, right? There are some people who would argue with that. The British called it, in their colonialization, they called it the white man's burden. Wow, that's some interesting rhetoric right there. The French called their colonialism mission civilisatrice. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it means the civilizing mission. And we called it here, when we conquered the United States, we called it manifest destiny. Israel calls it the promised land, the land that was promised to them by God. And so war begins. Two sides drawing in those around them, civil wars breaking out, extremists abounding, just as Thucydides talks about over 2,000 years ago in Greece. And you know something's wrong when they start using fancy words to justify atrocities. When you see laws being bended to suit the needs of the powerful, when you see recklessness as courage, thoughtfulness as cowardice, you know we've got some problems going on. And that cycle continues, and history repeats itself. How do we stop this cycle of violence? How do we learn from history, finally learn from it? Particularly something that seems so overwhelming in its complexity. When those who have been oppressed and lash out to keep their power so they don't get oppressed again. And you can't blame them for that, for wanting to be on the other side of oppression. And there are instances when it is stopped in history, times when the cycle was broken or almost broken. I think we can look to those peacemakers from the past to learn from them, rather than looking at the cycles of violence. There's a famous passage by a very famous rabbi. You all know him as Jesus. Jesus was a Jew. He saw the oppression of the Romans and the collusion of some of his brothers with that power, And he, like the Palestinians, like the ancient Jews, was trying to find ways to deal with oppression and abuse by those who were in power. And only he didn't do what everybody else did. He didn't resort to violence. He didn't try to rename the oppression or the revolution. He stopped and he listened. He ate dinner with those who were oppressed and those who were the oppressors. He made people see one another as brothers and sisters. Here's one of the tales that they tell about how he did this, and I think it's a very fascinating, beautiful tale. It's in the Gospel of John, book 8. It says, Jesus is teaching in the temple, and the people in power, they brought a woman who had been caught in adultery to him. And making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Hey, Rabbi, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now the law of Moses commands us to stone such a woman. What do you say?" John has a little commentary. It says, they did this to test him so that he might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus does something very odd. He bends down and he wrote with his finger something on the ground. Now they kept asking him, "Well, what do you think? Come on." And he straightened up and he said to them, "Let any among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and he wrote on the ground. Well, when they heard it, John says, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. He straightened up and said, "Hey, where are they? Is no one condemning you?" She said, "No one." Jesus said, "Well, neither do I. Go on your way and try not to do that again." In this story, we see, people who are trying to live in that binary. You have to choose a side. Stoning was a big deal in the ancient world, but it was not common by any stretch of the imagination. Remember, if you're going to stone someone, which is a form of capital punishment, and it is in the Hebrew scriptures, the Talmud, which is their sort of interpretation of how do we then put this all into law, Talmud says you have to have 2 witnesses. No witnesses were brought forth. He said you must have been warned of the consequences by these 2 witnesses beforehand, and only after that, then immediately commit the sin immediately after being warned. The witnesses cannot be related to either of the parties. The witnesses have to see one another. There have to be 23 judges and 13 of them have to agree. And here's the biggest thing. Witnesses had to be the executioners. Stoning was a very rare event in the Jewish world. Extremely rare. But notice that Jesus doesn't talk about blame, about who is right or wrong, really. He doesn't go there. He starts writing something in the sand. Because you see, the other part that the Talmud talks about is that that's an extreme thing if you're going to go to stoning. Really, when conflict arose between 2 parties, mediators were brought in to try and reconcile the parties. And the names of these parties in conflict were written in sand, in the dirt, so they could be easily erased after they were reconciled. As opposed to, say, being written in stone, which is much harder to erase. Now, whose name, I wonder, was he writing in that sand? Was it those of the accused and the woman and maybe her husband? Perhaps it was those who were challenging him, who knew really that they were abusing their power, and they were shamed and went away. I personally think that the good rabbi was showing each of them that they can either play a part in the cycle of violence, or they can play a part in reconciliation. All of these governments and military organizations play a part in the violence in Palestine and Israel. Each sees one another as Satan, as it were. Some may have tried for peace while all still supporting one side. That's what the U.S. did, right? We've been trying to broker peace for a really long time, and yet we've supported Israel militarily. So why in the world would the Palestinians trust that peace? And we're all surprised when the peace gets broken. Everyone wants to blame everyone else. Everyone is Satan, is the potential betrayer. And so you end up with this. Everyone's getting clobbered. The innocent are getting killed. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. There is no one who is without sin in this, none. We too are responsible. We have our own part to play in this violence by continuing this argument of right or wrong, by taking sides, by pointing fingers in blame. Because the fascinating thing is that both of these peoples, they have so much in common. Both sides have done acts of terror. Both sides have lost generations to war. Both sides have lost hope for peace. Both sides live in fear. So what ends all this? It seems that so few of the Jewish and the Palestinian people recognize that they have something in common. There's a story I read about a colleague of ours who, when she went to Israel, she met this Jewish woman whose sons had been killed as they were walking home from school one day. She wrote this beautiful book about healing through grief and started a bunch of support groups in Israel. And when my colleague asked her, so are Palestinian women whose sons were killed also invited to this group? The look was one of surprise and no. Because that's where we are, it seems like, right now. Both sides cannot see one another as anything but Satan. They are neighbors and they are intimates. They feel betrayed by one another. It's so incredibly sad to me that they cannot see this, and so the cycle continues and history repeats itself. So if you're a peace-loving person, what do? How do we stop this? And I mean we all parties in all of this. You know, there's only one thing in the history of the world that has ever stopped the cycle of violence. Ever. And that's love. And it seems so corny, right? So it's such a little word, four-letter word. But I'm not talking about that trite, smarmy, sentimental kind of love. I'm talking one that calls people to their better selves. One that sees us as connected, that we are siblings, that we are neighbors, not Satan. When we stop that rhetoric and the blaming, I'm talking about that hard work of reconciliation, of hearing each other's pain and stories, of recognizing our own ability to do evil as well as our ability to do good. It's to see that part that we play. Einstein said, peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding. He was a very learned man and knew his history. This happens even in our daily lives when conflict happens, not just in the Middle East. We live in this really blaming culture, right? We want to find out who's to blame for everything. I love what's going on right now in Flint, Michigan, right? Everybody's sort of like pointing fingers and blaming, and I want to say, will you stop it and solve the problem? You know, this even comes down to me personally. Some of you know that I was recently in a car accident. It's the worst car accident I've been in, but both people walked away, so we're fine. Basically what happened was, it was a dark night, pulling out of a blind alley, taking a left-hand turn. He came this way. I didn't see him, he didn't see me. He spun me around about 180. I don't think I've actually ever screamed before, but I did. I had a airbag go off, his airbag go off, his car is totaled. Mine is in the shop. Now, he was a good guy. He immediately came over, said, you know, are you okay? Are you all right? Helped me out, that kind of thing. I was very shaken up by all of it. All I could think it was, I swear, I looked, you know, to see if anything was happening. It was a little blind, I get that, but you know, you think I would have seen his lights or something. I didn't see anything. I kept thinking, well, I'm sure he was speeding. I mean, it's Orange County, people, you know. But he said, you know, look, you came out of nowhere. I didn't even have time to hit the brakes. And we talked, we exchanged things. It was very civil, very nice. Everything went just fine. And I found out later, though, that the police said that I am 51% responsible. And I remember I kind of was like, okay, I get it. I'm the one who's responsible for making sure a left-hand turn is thing. And he had warned me ahead of time that might be the case. But there was this part of me was like, but he was speeding. Well, he said he wasn't. Well, of course he's not going to say he was speeding. And I remember I felt really angry and hurt that I was the one who was to shoulder the blame for this, right? That I'm the one who had to have the responsibility for it. And I get why he didn't. He was a good guy. And he didn't have collision, so he gets his car fixed. It'll be fine. So I have collision. So but I felt like I hadn't been heard. And I think that's what happens when you have people on both sides have responsibilities. They both need to be heard. That's part of reconciliation. It happened the entire Peloponnesian War as well. Everything is spreading. And it was sort of funny, actually. So here's the great irony. I was coming out of a Zen meditation class. Yes, right. Now nobody saw this. I left a little bit early before mine. I had gone with a friend of mine. And so I had gone back in to get her because I was really shaken up. So she comes out, and I was sort of fascinated by she immediately took my side. Right? Like she couldn't conceive that, that I would make a mistake. Well, it must be him, Well, can't believe it. Well, let's get the police here. And, the whole bit. And I was like, look at her going, he's a nice guy. He's fine, Can we just both be responsible and say that, we both made a mistake here, and we both probably could have done a lot better. But it was fascinating to me to watch that, because that's what we do, right? Well, I love this person, I like this person, so therefore I'm going to side with them, irregardless of what it might actually be. That's what we kind of do when in conflict. And that's how conflict spreads. Because we think that we have to take sides. Though I really appreciated her support. In the West Bank, there's this wall that's built. When it's done in a few years, or I think it's close to being done, it'll be about 430 miles long. It separates Israel and the West Bank. Now, Israel says that it's keep suicide bombers out. I'm sure that's part of it. But it also serves to oppress and keep good people away from their jobs, from food, from water, from their religious sites. It's been condemned by international law, and even Israel's Supreme Court said, okay, part of it you've got to take down. Which I thought was sort of interesting. Reverend Davies, who was a Unitarian minister, he said, how strange and foolish are these walls of separation that divide us, whether they are physical or they are of the heart. I like to think that somewhere, some people do know the truth. Because while you see a lot of graffiti like this, you also see graffiti like this. People are fighting for reconciliation there. There are grassroots movements, but the big players are not there. But I like to think that Jesus was also grassroots, and that small talks can grow into something bigger. Because here's the issue I think that's going on in the Middle East. I think it's the issue that affects us all here in our own colonialism. Is that we keep wanting peace without reconciliation. We want to pass that by. We want peace without justice, peace that only looks at physical borders, not the borders of our minds and our hearts. We want peace to be about where houses are built or water rights. And none of that will be resolved until each side doesn't see Satan, but each sees one another as a brother and a sister that can see Satan in themselves, maybe. And only when all sides can take that responsibility can we then reconcile. Only then can we erase those names in the sand. So we've got a lot of hard work of truth-telling, of justice-making, of reconciliation. And until then, we are doomed to repeat history, to continue that cycle of violence. Until then, we're all just casting stones. Shalom, salam, blessed be, and amen. Let's take a couple of deep breaths. Let us join our voices together.